Hello, I'm Ivo Dalder, President of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Thank you for joining us from across the globe for an important and timely conversation. This event concludes our four-part series entitled A Century of Global Leadership, marking the Council's centenary anniversary early in 2022. Over the past few months, we have reflected on our history, the history of our engagement in the world, seen through the lens of one of the oldest public affairs organizations in the United States. A century ago, the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution granted women in the United States the right to vote. And shortly thereafter, the Council was founded out of a commitment to help Chicagoans understand the importance of America's global engagement. Women played a leading role in the Council from its very inception. More than half of its founders were women, as was one of its first co-chairs. And in 1942, it was the first organization of its kind to be led by a woman, Louise Wright. Women have broken traditional barriers and have proven to be dynamic and effective leaders who play a significant role in shaping and implementing U.S. foreign policy and national security. It is our great honor to recognize this important legacy by presenting Secretaries of State Madeleine Albright and Condoleezza Rice with our Centennial Global Leadership Award for their significant leadership and diplomatic achievements. As diplomats, advisors, experts, and authors, they have indelibly shaped America's role in the world. This series is made possible by the incredible generosity of our sponsors. We're grateful for their persistent and unwavering support. The full list of donors is available on our website, and I hope that you will all consider investing in our work as we look forward to our next century. And now it is my great honor to introduce our distinguished Centennial Global Leadership Award honorees. Madeleine Albright served as the 64th U.S. Secretary of State of the United States and the first woman to hold that position. At the time, Secretary Albright was the highest-ranking woman in the history of the U.S. government. She is now a professor in the practice of diplomacy at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service and chair of Albright Stonebridge Group. She also chairs the National Democratic Institute, serves as the president of the Truman Scholarship Foundation, and is the honorary chair of the World Refugee and Migration Council. Condoleezza Rice served as the 66th Secretary of State of the United States, the second woman and the first Black woman to hold that position. She also served as President George W. Bush's Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs and was the first woman to hold that position. She is now the Tad and Diane Taub Director of the Hoover Institution and the Thomas and Barbara Stevenson Senior Fellow on Public Policy. She's a founding partner of Rice, Hatley, Gates, and Manuel LLC, and she serves on several boards. Secretary Albright, Secretary Rice, thank you so much for joining us today. It's really wonderful to have you. You're both trailblazers as women leaders in foreign policy. Can you share what this journey looked like to you?
Well, it's hard to explain how I got from here to there. I am the daughter of a diplomat, but a refugee that came to the United States in 1948. My father was the ultimate professor and always talked about diplomatic history and what I had to learn about democracy and public service. But in terms of a path, there really wasn't one, because it never occurred to me that I could have a job such as being Secretary of State. I'd never seen a woman Secretary of State, but I also was unclear whether there really was a path to it. And so there are people who thought I was overly ambitious, that I'd had this plan all along. I never had. And so I do think that that's an important point to make, is that it never occurred to me that I could have a job representing the country that had taken us in as refugees.
It's a remarkable, the journey doesn't go by itself. It just happens in some ways, but you have to take steps too. Secretary Rice, where did your journey start and how did you get there?
Well, my explanation is actually really easy. I was a failed piano major. I was supposed to be a great concert pianist. I thought I was going to be Van Cliburn, not the Secretary of State. And so At the end of my sophomore year, when I went to the Aspen Music Festival School and met those 12-year-olds who could play from sight what it took me every year, all year to learn, I thought, find another path. And at the end of my junior year, I wandered into a class at the University of Denver taught by a man named Joseph Corbell, who was Madeleine's father. And Joseph Corbell introduced me to things Russian to Eastern Europe. He was a wonderful storyteller about diplomacy. And I thought, this is what I want to do. I want to be in international politics somehow. And he was also just very encouraging that this was a completely natural move from piano to international politics. And so I love the story because as a professor, I often say to my students, first of all, you never know what your path might be. I spoke to a group of freshmen and sophomores just a couple of days ago, and I said to them, when I was sitting in your seat, I was a piano major. So think broadly about what you might want to do. And the other thing that I love about the story is it was really one class that turned me around and one great professor.
One class, one great professors, and one of the things that also unites both of you, you're still professors. You still go out and work with the next generation to inspire them, which is such a wonderful thing. Secretary Albright, being the first is never easy. Breaking glass ceilings is hard. You already mentioned you didn't have a role model. What was the pressure like in being the first? How did that change, or how did you adapt to that reality?
Well, since it never occurred to me that I would have that job, I had to be in it in order to adapt to it. But I will never forget, I had been been agreed to be Secretary of State. By the way, 99-0. That is not something that happens very much anymore. And I was walking into the State Department on the 7th floor, which is this mahogany hall that is lined with portraits of all the former Secretaries of State. And they were only distinguished from each other as to whether they were clean-shaven or had beards. And I thought to myself, when my portrait goes up, the walls will shake a bit. And I think they actually did, because it was a big surprise to many people that a woman could be Secretary of State. And by the way, when my name was out there, I talk about this period as the period of great mentioning. Secretary Christopher had decided that he wasn't going to stay for a second term. And so all of a sudden, there were questions about who would be the next Secretary of State. I, at that time, was the ambassador to the United Nations and a member of the cabinet. So my name came up during this period of great mentioning. And then somebody said a woman could not be Secretary of State because Arab leaders would not deal with a woman. And so the Arab ambassadors at the UN got together and said, we've had no problems dealing with Ambassador Albright. We wouldn't have any problems dealing with Secretary Albright. And then somebody at the White House, and I never want to know who, said, yes, Madeleine's on the list, but she's second tier. And so I thought, well, I'll never be Secretary of State. So it did surprise me when, in fact, I did become the first woman Secretary of State.
Well, you certainly proved that person wrong, no doubt, and a wonderful Secretary of State you were as well. Secretary Rice, you didn't have quite the same first in being Secretary of State. You were the first Black woman to be Secretary of State, following, of course, after Madeleine Albright and Colin Powell. What was the pressure on you? How did you feel it, and how did you handle it?
One of the things to remember about being a first is that you rarely just set out to be the first. I think you simply believe you're qualified for the job and the opportunity comes, and so you do it. I remember a conversation with my good friend, the late Sally Ride, the first woman in space. And Sally said, I didn't want to be the first woman in space. I just wanted to be in space. And so it's really after you're appointed that people start talking about the first this, the first that. I was the first woman to be National Security Advisor. And I was National Security Advisor for the 4 years of the first term of the George W. Bush administration. I was very close to the president all the way from the time that he first started to run in '99. and 1999. And so when Colin Powell decided that he didn't want to stay, it felt, I guess, a little bit more natural in a sense than what Madeleine went through. There was a lot of talk that I would, of course, quote unquote, become Secretary of State. And so I didn't feel any particular pressure going in. I had to get used to the fact that it was a different kind of relationship with the president. I remember saying to the president when he asked me to be Secretary of State, we were up at Camp David after the election was over. And he said, you know, Colin is not going to stay. I want you to be Secretary of State. And I remember saying to him, but I don't want to lose contact with you. I've been down the hallway. I've been in and out of the Oval Office 7-8 times a day. I've traveled with you. How are we going to keep that going? And so I was more concerned about this, keeping this special relationship in place, because a Secretary of State has to have the support of the president. When you go out there and you're traveling the world, people have to know that you speak for the president. And so I was more concerned about those kinds of issues. And I will say something very funny happened to me. I was talking to Jim Baker about it, and he said, you know, the time's going to come when you don't want to travel with the president anymore. And I thought, what are you talking about? And he said, well, he said, you're going to find, you know, you have your own plane. People are on your schedule. And sure enough, about a year in, I thought, I kind of like traveling as Secretary of State, not as with the president. And toward the end of the term, the president was calling me to say, is this job important enough? Is this trip important enough for you to go on? Or are you going to go do something else? And so I think it was more the changed relationship that I had to get accustomed to.
But it worked in some ways. You have an independent power base, I guess,
Yes.
as Secretary of State, and just as you described it, and yet the closeness with the president also gives you power in that relationship. And I think you managed it very adroitly to move from staffing to leading in that sense.
Yeah, you do learn, and Madeleine talked about the portraits on the wall. It really is a position that has so much history in our country that when you suddenly occupy that position, Madeleine is the first woman. You know your predecessor several times removed was Thomas Jefferson, and you walk in and there's all of this history to being Secretary of State. You're the first cabinet position that was created by the founders. And so even something like, and I remember seeing Madeleine for the first time in this role, when the president gives the State of the Union, it is the Secretary of State that leads in the cabinet. And I remember watching Madeleine on TV that night and thinking, wow, that's really cool. You know, I'll bet Thomas Jefferson never thought that was going to be a woman at the head of that parade.
I have to say that was quite a moment. The other part that came with the job was something that had never occurred to me. During the State of the Union, there are all that, the question is, when does the audience, those are members of Congress, stand up to applaud the president? And they're really looking to the Secretary of State to be the first one to stand up. And so all of a sudden you've got some assignment that truly never occurred to you, is how to be that kind of a cheerleader. But it really was exciting to go in there leading the crowd down that aisle, you know, when they say, Mr. President, the president's cabinet, you know, so it was
I do have to tell you one other thing you learned that you are as Secretary of State, that even foreign policy specialists don't know. I wondered why I kept signing all kinds of things, commissions and the treaties. And well, because the Secretary of State is the keeper of the Great Seal of the United States of America. It means you're the notary of the country. And so when Richard Nixon resigned, it was Henry Kissinger that had to countersign his letter along with Gerald Ford. So there's some wonderful history around being Secretary of State, and I really actually love that part.
Well, and it's interesting that sort of the name Secretary of State probably comes from that more notary part of the
Ministerial,
of the
yes.
ministerial, in a traditional ministerial job rather than foreign affairs,
Right.
which of course was different, which is why we have secretaries of states in all of our states
Yes.
for that purpose. Secretary Albright, you've been quoted as saying that women must work harder than men. In fact, you've said there's really no room at all for mediocrity when it comes to women in power. Elaborate on that. What does that really mean for women who are seeking careers in foreign affairs or indeed in anything else?
Well, I really do think that any career requires knowledge and understanding what it's about, and not just thinking that you're going to walk in and do the job. It becomes even more important the higher the job goes up, because you know that people are listening to what you have to say and you are speaking on behalf of the country. But you do need to know what you're talking about. You can't just kind of pretend that you know the subject. And therefore, you have to be very prepared for the discussion that is coming up, because all of a sudden, if you say, well, I didn't know that, or are you sure that is really what happened, you cast doubt on yourself. And so I really do think there is this issue about you can't have any mediocrity. That is not to say that there's plenty of room for mediocre men, but there is no room for mediocre women. And when you open your mouth in a meeting, you do have to know what you're talking about. And partially, and I have said this even before I had the great job of being Secretary of State, you are usually, or you used to be, the only woman in the room. And you think to yourself, well, I'd like to say something. And then you think, oh my goodness, people will think it's stupid, and you don't say it. And then some man says it and everybody thinks it's brilliant. And you think, why didn't I say that? Or if you raise your hand, you don't get called on until what you wanted to say was not germane. So I made up this rule for myself, and I've also tried it out on my students, is that you have to, I made up this term, do active listening, so that you know when you are going to say something, what you're going to say, and say it in a firm voice. So interrupting is one of the important parts. And to interrupt, you really do need to know what you're about to say.
Right. I agree completely with Madeleine. I've kind of grown up with this notion. I grew up in segregated Birmingham, Alabama. And I grew up in a very nice little community. I think everybody taught school. I think there was one lawyer, one doctor. Everybody else was a school teacher, including my parents. And they used to say, that community, you have to be twice as good. And they meant it as an answer to segregation, that if you were twice as good, no one could stop you. And so you worked twice as hard, and then you became twice as confident. And so I never had that kind of crisis of confidence. I always felt like I had prepared to be twice as good. And so I think growing up Black and female, and I would emphasize in that case Black, that I came in with a sense that I needed to establish myself, but I needed to know what I was talking about in order to establish myself. To this day, I tell my students, I value your opinions, but not your uninformed ones. And so there can be a little bit too much kind of flying blind and just saying what comes to your mind. One of the great things about being different and making that judgment that Madeleine talked about is you really want to know what you're talking about. And I might just add, that was one thing that I found a little bit difficult as an academic going into a very high role, because academics know things in such depth. I once knew more about the Soviet General Staff than they knew about themselves. Well, when you're Secretary of State, you're never going to have that kind of depth of knowledge on everything that you're doing. So you have to become very good at questioning people, at preparing to ask the next couple of levels of questions to what experts will you trust. And that's a skill that you have to learn as you go up the ladder. I was fortunate. I'd been provost of Stanford, which is the chief operating officer. And I always said that my preparation was when the physics department wanted a $17 million telescope, I was not going to debate the physics with the 3 Nobel laureates that they sent to tell me why we needed the telescope, but I still had to make a decision. And so as you go up the ladder, you become less expert. It's just the nature of things, but you have to learn how to mobilize expertise on your behalf.
That's an excellent point. And I think this transition from academic to policymaker, you have this tendency of trying to explain everything, but you lose the sight of, but so what? What are you going to do about it? is what you learn in government. Secretary Albright, as the nation's top diplomat, as the first woman, did you feel you were being treated differently with heads of state? Did you feel you had to work the issue in a different way because you were the first woman, or did that have no impact on how you did the job?
Well, it did have an impact, obviously, because there had been enough discussion during that period of great mentioning whether a woman could be Secretary of State. And it's unbelievable when you actually do arrive in a foreign country. By the way, you do come in a large plane that says United States of America. And one of the things that truly does happen is the leaders of foreign countries know that if they are going to have a conversation at ministerial level, they're going to have to talk with whoever is the Secretary of State. But I will never forget my first meeting, actually, with the Gulf Cooperation Council, which were all Arab leaders. And we are there, and they couldn't have been nicer. And I finally said, perhaps you've noticed I'm not dressed the same way as my predecessors, and you have been very kind. And next time we'll talk about women's rights. And we did, because I do think that one has to be prepared going into meetings to deliver the messages that you're supposed to deliver. But I have had some fairly nasty meetings where people were patronizing. And one of them, my life, and Condi knows this, is so totally accidental, because my father was the Czechoslovak ambassador to Yugoslavia right after World War II. And so my first diplomatic experience, the little girl at the national airport, they give flowers at the airport. That's what I did for a living. So I gave flowers to Tito and various people. But then, and I did know an awful lot about Yugoslavia. So the fact, and actually, Ivo, you and I worked on these things together, that was an accident of history to really know things. And Milosevic was the president of Serbia, and I had to meet with him, and he was trying to charm me. I was determined not to be charmed, because I knew the kinds of things that he had done. And he started telling me, and by the way, when we used to shake hands with people, it's kind of an automatic gesture by Americans when you shake hands to smile. And I was determined not to smile. So there's some photographs of me looking so grim, kind of gritting my teeth, that he started telling me the history of the Serbs, and which was somewhat different than the one I knew. And so I said, I know the history of the Serbs. We certainly did not get along, but you have to get used to delivering the message. You are representing the United States. The president, you are the chief diplomatic person in the government, and you have to get used to it no matter how they treat you. But I did not find, frankly, that there was discrimination against women, because they knew that they would have to deal with me if they were going to get the message to the White House.
In that sense, Secretary Rice, was position more important than in some ways how you were treated than who you were as a person?
I've always said that if they treat you badly as Secretary of State because you're a woman, it's actually your fault, not theirs, because you've got plenty of arrows in your quiver to deal with that circumstance. And I think they know, as Madeleine said, you're the Secretary of State, and basically they need the Secretary of State. And so the fact that she's maybe wearing a skirt really, I think, matters a lot less. I do think I ran into circumstances that some people might have interpreted, well, they're doing it because she's a woman. I actually think it sometimes was just the personality of the leaders. Vladimir Putin was somebody who wanted to intimidate. He wanted to put people down. I think he would have done it whatever gender you were. Madeleine and I both speak Russian, and so you could listen to him in the native language and hear the rather harsh way that he spoke the language. And so at the beginning, he sort of liked me, I think, because I was a Russianist and things were going pretty well. As it got more and more fraught between the two countries, the relationship got somewhat chillier from time to time. And I remember once going in 2007 to tell him that President Bush wanted me to say, if something happens with Georgia, that will have an effect on U.S.-Russian relations. As you know, they invaded Georgia in 2008. And so things were pretty tense. And we were sitting in a room, Bill Burns, our then ambassador to Russia, on one sofa with me, and on the other, Putin and Sergei Lavrov on the other. And I said this, and all of a sudden Putin stood up, and then he was sort of peering over me. But, you know, my instinct was stand up too. And so I did, and I'm actually pretty tall. And so I stood up, and he sort of backed off. And I thought back on that. Would he have done that to, you know, to Colin Powell, or would he have done that to? I don't think it really matters. I think it's who he is. And so sometimes it's important not to take on the notion, well, he did that because I'm a woman. He's, you know, he was just a bully, and I think he would have tried to bully anybody.
Yeah, bully is certainly the right way to think about it. I know he tried to intimidate men too. Sometimes worked, sometimes didn't. Exactly right. 7% of the women, 7% of the world leaders today are women. And when we look at the coronavirus, some of the most successful countries dealing with the virus, from Denmark and some of the Nordic countries to New Zealand to Taiwan, have been led by women. Do you think, Secretary Albright, that there's something in women leaders that makes them more effective to deal with this kinds of crisis than perhaps others?
I actually do, because it was interesting at the beginning, exactly the kind of list that you're putting out. And I think partially, and there's some people who disagree with this, but I do think women and men approach problems differently. I think because so many women have to multitask, women have kind of a way of looking at things from the 360, of really looking in a number of different ways of problems, being able to understand them. Then also, I think there's a way of being, women care for people, spend a lot of time in doing some kind of caring, either for their parents or their children, and are kind of set in terms of trying to sort out how you would deal with complicated situations. I do think men, for instance, have the capability of thinking more deeply about one subject, and women are better at kind of focusing or not focusing on one subject and looking at a lot of different issues. I do think it was interesting to see how many of those countries initially were better at dealing with a sickness, a pandemic, which is something that was not unheard of for women. It doesn't mean that afterwards they all succeeded. I think what's so interesting, Evo, more and more, is how many women leaders there are, because there were not. And also there were not in other jobs. I mean, when I was at the United Nations, there were at that stage 183 countries in the UN. And it was one of the first times I didn't have to cook lunch myself. So I said to my assistant, invite the other women, permanent representatives, to lunch at my residence. And when I get there, there's 6 other countries there: Canada, Kazakhstan, Philippines, Trinidad, Tobago, Jamaica, and Liechtenstein, and me. Being the American, I decided to form a caucus, and we called ourselves the G7. And what we did was to lobby on behalf of having women judges on the War Crimes Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, for instance. So we spent a lot of time talking to each other. We all made an agreement, very much of a girls' agreement, that we would always take each other's telephone calls. And some of the men that were ambassadors resented that. So I actually had the gall to say, have yourself replaced by a woman, and I will take your call, even if you are from Liechtenstein. So I do think that kind of way of combining our talents to think about different issues simultaneously and being able to deal with others, I think is something that women are pretty good at.
Secretary Rice?
I think it depends. On the circumstances. I can think of some circumstances in which women, there was a sort of presence that they have. I think about Liberia and Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. It was almost as if this kind of school marm grandma was going to pull this country up by its ear. And so there's a sense in which I think I can't imagine anybody else doing that at that point in Liberia. On a not international side, Kay Ivey, the governor of Alabama. So you would be surprised to know that Alabama had an early mask mandate. So why? Because Kay Ivey was a 74-year-old cancer survivor, and she got on television and she said, y'all, we're going to wear masks. And that was it. So I think there are some circumstances in which that sort of sense of you're all my family, we're going to do this together, that women clearly do very, very well is important. But I don't know whether or not this is an explanation for what happened with COVID. I will say the one characteristic that I've seen differently with women is that I think we're better listeners. And I see this in my classes where before I finish the question, the men have their hands raised, whereas the women are sitting back a little bit and listening. And I do think that being a good listener is a part of being a good diplomat, and finding interest overlap with other even adversarial circumstances or adversaries. And since I do think women step back and listen a little bit before they fire, that may be a place that we see the difference, and maybe there it does matter.
Active listening, and something somebody tells me I need to do better too. So I appreciate that. Very important. Beyond the West, but even in the West, we see increasingly in governments dominated by strong men, in this case, whether it's in Brazil or in Turkey or in Russia or indeed in China, in India, and so many other places. And I wonder, you both have done so much and spent so much of your life in defense of and promoting liberal democracy. Secretary Rice, at this moment, when you look at these new leaders who really are trying to undermine democratic government, or at least liberal government, whether that concerns you, and how you think we need to deal with this.
I am concerned about it. I do think we have to have a long arc when we look at democracy in the so-called democratic recession. I used to teach a course at Stanford in the 80s. It's actually the first course that I taught, called The Role of the Military in Politics. And I could always talk about at least 2 or 3 Latin American coups, 4 or 5 juntas in Africa. We do have to remember that the last 30 years or so have been pretty good for democracy. We've had some regression, there's no doubt about that. And when I try to analyze why this is happening, I look at it less as the rise of a single person than the absence of a rich institutional landscape to check the power of one person. So if I look, for instance, at Viktor Orban in Hungary, I look at somebody who basically the opposition sort of wilted away. He used then the electoral system to be elected with huge numbers, then used those huge numbers to start to change the constitutional basis. And so I think we have to be a little bit careful to really do the analysis of what's happening in these places. And in unconsolidated democracies, you're always vulnerable to the rise of the single strong president. One of the things that the United States founding fathers did right was to create a circumstance or a set of institutions of distributed power. So with 3 branches of co-equal branches of government, it's kind of hard to become a strongman. And I think we can do a lot more in institutional design with these countries to make them more resilient to this rise. It's a case of unconsolidated democracy in Brazil, unconsolidated democracy to a certain extent in Poland. And so I think as students of this, it's worth it to go back and look at how these things happen.
Very interesting, I think, of figuring out not only how to get people to vote, which is one of the things we've try to do, but then have the institutions that guard against backsliding. Secretary Albright, you've spent your entire life on this issue in one form or another, and of course, head of the National Democratic Institute, still do on a day-to-day basis. How concerned are you about this? You've written a recent book addressing part of this, and how do you think we can deal with the backsliding in democracy that we do see?
Well, I do think I did write a book called Fascism, A Warning, because I was trying to figure out what really happens in societies when there is a leader who takes advantage of a negative mood in a country. Mussolini was the first fascist. And what happened was the Italians were not respected for their role during World War I. And then their economy was not doing well. And all of a sudden, this outsider kind of comes in and has some easy answers for things and begins to identify himself with one group at the expense of another, which then becomes the scapegoat, the one that's responsible for everything. The issue, and the best quote in that book actually comes from Mussolini, who says, if you pluck a chicken one feather at a time, nobody notices. So it's kind of one step that leads to another. And then another part of it that is very basic is an appeal to nationalism. So Viktor Orban, for instance, Hungary is a complicated country because they lost so much territory after World War I. And so there is a kind of natural constituency for saying that they were not treated properly, that they need some of the land that is in Slovakia and Croatia back. And so what happened was, and by the way, I met Viktor Orban in the 1980s, and he was everybody's favorite dissident. He started a party of young people. And then all of a sudden, he kind of became enraptured with this nationalist tendency and was smart enough to figure out how to undermine everybody else. And so I do think you then get a leader who deliberately who thinks he's above the law, does not respect the press, but has divided people according to their beliefs. And as I said, pits one group against another. That's the really dangerous part.
If I could just add one other thing too here, I think as those of us who want to see democracies thrive and be consolidated, it's incredibly important, even if you have these strong men, to keep something alive in civil society. Something that can fight back, if you will, or even if it stays underground. I mean, Poland is a really interesting example of solidarity that managed to stay underground after the military junta and emerged again when the circumstances made it possible in '89. I think if you look at some of these places today, I watch very carefully whether Poland, for instance, whether you are maintaining something of civil society. And once in a while, it raises its head and says, no further. Turkey is an interesting place because you have a business community and you have a kind of diaspora there. So one of the things that we can do, even in the darkest times, is to see if you can keep some of these counter-institutional pressures alive in these countries.
Yeah, not everything is lost just because a singular person is trying to retain and maintain power by himself. I think that's a really very good idea that we need to focus on. You can always fight back, and you need to fight back, and there are parts of society that does that. At this point, we'd like to take some questions from our audience, and we have 3 taped questions for you from young women leaders. Let's start with Madeleine Sampaio, who is the Youth Ambassador at UNODC Brazil and a 2021 Voices That Inspire Vital Voices Global Partnership.
I'm 21 years old and I'm a Brazilian activist. I am also a Youth Ambassador from UNODC Brazil, and I'm one of the Voices Inspire from Vital Voices. I'm here in the UK participating in COP26, and I would like to know how you assess the importance of women in tackling the climate crisis. Why is it important to have more women in spaces that decide our future?
Secretary Rice?
Well, first of all, you're a very, very impressive person, and I just would say to you, keep after it, and keep finding ever more responsible ways to express your leadership skills. What we're experiencing in the climate crisis is something that I think is in many ways unfamiliar, because it is going to touch every aspect of life across the globe in ways that really maybe only great world wars, but even those don't have the impact that you have on every aspect of life. And so in that sense, I think we have to have a diversity of people with different experiences who are involved in crafting responses to climate change. I think it's extremely important, for instance, that this not just be something that's left to the developed world, because we know that the developing world, if you're in the Caribbean, for instance, your way of life is going to be threatened well before the way of life of the United States or France or whatever. So the first thing is to make sure that you have a diversity of voices and interests of those most on the front line. Again, with women, women bring different experiences. And so I think bringing in people who have, as Madeleine called it, multitasked around family, around children, around education, around keeping the home fires burning, if you will, even if they themselves are great leaders, it's important to have that variety of experiences. And so given the nature of this crisis, I would say in this challenge to us, I would say even more important in this area to have diverse voices than in almost any other that I can think of.
Secretary Albright, you want to add anything?
Well, I'd like to say that what is so important is to have young women involved in this, because this is a problem that is going to hit even harder on that generation. And having people that are very conscious about the scientific background of things, how it's going to affect people, I think is important and compelling, coming from those that will, in fact, be affected in many different ways and can speak. I also think this goes back to something that Condi said, which is people outside of the governmental system. Vital Voices is a perfect example of that, of people in civil society that are dedicated to raising their voices on behalf of issues that have to do with all the full societies, whether these are political or environmental or pandemics or whatever. I do think that it's a perfect example that the governments can't do everything.
We have another question from Sharon Matongo, who is the co-founder, Charity Drive Zimbabwe, and Kofi Annan Changemaker.
Hello, my name is Sharon Matongo and I'm from Zimbabwe. I'm extremely honored to be able to ask you this question. I'm curious to know if you believe that over the next few years, there is room for states across the world to adopt a feminist approach to foreign policy, and how do we motivate states to adopt such an approach beyond the moral imperative to do so? Is there perhaps an economic imperative that justifies the same? Thank you.
Secretary Albright?
Well, I do think that I'm a feminist, so I do believe that there is a feminist approach, but also, even if I weren't, more than half the population of every country is women. And it is the waste of a resource and of talent not to get women involved in the various issues that are out there. And so I do think that it's important for people to understand, women, that we all have a duty to be a part of the system, whether it's the governmental one or operating from the societies themselves, because there are so many issues out there that need to be done, that need to be dealt with by those who have a dedication to solving problems. And I do think women are pretty good problem solvers also. So there are a number of, I can argue this all from a feminist perspective, but also from a practical, if I could put it that way, of so many parts of our society where women are dominant. And if you don't use the women, then you are giving up on having problem solvers and a resource that has been wasted.
I would also add that I think the lens call it a feminist foreign policy or an emphasis on the rights and well-being of women, that lens is very important to solving a lot of other problems. I always said if you could give me one intervention, it would be to advocate for women. Now, why would I say that? If you think you've got a population control problem in a country, educate a woman and she won't have 13 children and she won't have her first child at 12. If you've got a problem with trafficking in people, which we have internationally, educate a woman and she won't be trafficked into a brothel in Eastern Europe or, for that matter, in the United States of America. If you want to do something about the economic circumstances of a village, give a woman a small loan, a micro loan, and she will employ the whole village. If you want to do something about the horrors of what happens to women in conflict zones, and this is something that I tried to take up when I was Secretary of State, and we actually went to the UN and we said we're going to treat rape not as a consequence of war, but as a weapon of war, which means now men use it to dehumanize and degrade a whole society. Do something about that. You will change the nature of conflict. And finally, women will not want to send child soldiers because women will not want their children in that. And they will also help to change the behavior of their brothers and their husbands and their boys, their sons. And so I think you get a lot of purchase on a lot of the world's problems if you focus on how women, how advocating for and helping women might change a whole bigger landscape.
And our final question comes from Shayna Lewis, who is the Digital Campaigns Director, Win Without War, and a YP Ambassador at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs.
Hello, my name is Shayna Lewis, and I work at Win Without War, an organization that seeks to advance a progressive U.S. foreign policy, one rooted in peace, justice, and accountability. Can you talk about what people, especially those who don't work in government, can do to better advocate for a foreign policy that reflects their values? Thank you.
Secretary Albright?
Well, I think that the very important part, and it's kind of been a theme of the things that we've been talking about, is for women, especially, to get involved in public affairs, which doesn't mean just being in the government, but being conscious of the kinds of things that are going on and stating our views, and not waiting to be called on, but interrupting and really making clear that there are messages that need to be delivered, and that because in so many ways, I believe that domestic and foreign policy are part of the same story, it's very important for people to be able to explain the needs of the people in a country and how it then translates into the kind of national security or foreign policy that you want to have happen. I think frankly, I hope in terms of listening to both of us that we have had lives in which we have been involved in not just government, but in a number of kind of movements and activities where we try to bring honesty in terms of the way that we are dealing with issues and the importance of being involved and understanding that democracy is fragile but resilient. And what makes it resilient are the people, and that democracy is not a spectator sport. You have to participate.
I think Madeleine has said it very well, and I would just say one other thing. We actually live in a pretty complex world, and sometimes you have competing values. And it's really important to be willing to listen to others who may not share your views of precisely where you're going. Really important to listen to others because you have to hone your own views. You have to test your own views against a certain reality. I will just give you one example, the Taliban. What are you going to do about the Taliban? We may not want to fight the Taliban, But do we really want there to be a country on the face of the earth where women can't go to school and where women are whipped in a stadium that was given to them by the United Nations and executed for simply going outside of their houses? Those are competing values. And so I would just encourage anyone who wants to be a part of this dialogue and to move toward a particular view of foreign policy that you have to spend some time with people who don't agree. I tell my students all the time, if you are constantly in the company of people who say amen to everything you say, find other company. It's very easy these days to go into an echo chamber, very easy to just hang out with your tribe, with people who say things that reinforce your own view. And then suddenly, when you have to go into the arena of policymaking and defend your views and get support for them, you're not very well prepared. And so one of the best ways that you can prepare is to assume that you're going to have to talk to others who may not agree.
I can't think of a wiser way to end than on that note, to not only listen actively, as both of you have said, but also to be aware that other people may have different views, and understanding those views and dealing with them on a day-to-day basis is how you get stuff done. And that's what diplomats learn at an early age. I think we are extraordinarily fortunate to have two such premier diplomats spending the past 45 minutes with us on this conversation. You've made the world a better and more secure place for what you've done in government, but also what you continue to do outside of it. And we are deeply grateful to both of you for everything you have done. So thank you so much for being with us and joining us for this really special occasion.
Thank you.
Great to be with you. Thank you.